All right, let's start out with how your brain goes about making someone into an enemy. So let's, have a look at the mechanics of that. Now, most of you have probably heard of the phrase the limbic system. How many have heard the limbic system someplace along the way? All right. The limbic system in the brain has also been called the reptilian brain. You heard that phrase? Or the lower brain. We also have called it the control center. But the interesting thing about the limbic system is that doctors do not actually agree where it starts and stops. So when one person uses the phrase the limbic system, they might be thinking about some part of it. It would sort of be like we said, the road system around Austin. Where exactly is the end of it? Where does it start? It's the system in there. But somewhere early on, I think it was in the 1920s more or less, a doctor decided that this was actually a system that worked together, and he described it using the 4 F's, because that's what you could recognize it as doing. And so fighting, fleeing, feeding, and fornication were the 4 F's. And that became sort of the basis of how neurologists understood this. We were at a time when we thought about life as though people had urges, primal urges. They had these sort of animal instincts, instinctive behavior. All those phrases were very popular at the time. And so this was decided then would be the way that you looked at where the human being got all of their impulses and instincts for, to fight, flee, feed, and fornicate. And so this understanding was where a lot of our modern understanding of how the brain works developed. Now, the interesting thing is that, most medical people are pretty specialized. So you actually had different people studying the brain, but for different reasons, and reaching different conclusions about what was going on. So one of the groups that was studying the brain a lot was the addiction group. And so they found out that the addictions happen because they involve the brain's pleasure center. Have you heard of the pleasure center? Okay. Another group was talking about development, animal development in particular, and they were trying to figure out how do animals form a bond or an attachment. Why do little ducks follow whoever they see during a particular time? And they began to talk about the brain's attachment center. And it turns out that when Dr. Shore in the 1990s was set down to put together, I believe it was 9 different disciplines that had never been put together before, he found out that the exact same center of the brain that one group was saying was the attachment center was what the other group was calling the pleasure center. So the same thing was running human attachment as was running addictions. Except the two schools never talked to each other, so they had no idea. Recently, there was another marvelous genetic study that was discovered. And you know how it was discovered? Because the two groups of researchers went to the same coffee shop. So over at Harvard, one group was researching this, the other was researching that, and they were finding these marvelous discoveries, and having no idea that they had other implications, except as they're talking about it over coffee. So sometimes it happens in the library, sometimes over coffee. But the thing that we're looking at is that when you actually begin to look at what this limbic system does, it's not just fighting, fleeing, feeding, and fornication. It's also the center for family and for friends. And as we begin to look at it, it's also where spiritual or character formation happens. So all of a sudden, the same people who are talking about what makes you addicted are on the same page as the people who are talking about what force drives spiritual formation. Now, you wouldn't have thought those would be on the same page, would you? But that's because your brain is designed so that the biggest pleasure in your life, the thing that brings you the deepest joy, is having other people with you who love you. And it's those people who are able to tell you who you really are. And in fact, your brain's identity center is made up mostly of mirror neurons. And the interesting thing about mirror neurons is that they're unable to look at themselves. So neurologists will tell you the only way that you know who you are with the human brain is by looking in the eyes of others and seeing how they see you. So we're designed then that the community around us that we accept as our people, the way they look at us will tell us who we really are. And we're allowed to then be people we never were before. It's part of why entering the kingdom of God is like a little child. So a little child, you go in and you tell them, you know what, you're going to grow up and you're going to be this. And they go, really? I've never been that before. I'm not even sure what it is. But if you say so, you find that in me, I'll grow it. If it was at all there at all. So God has put stuff in you that you have never seen before. It's there waiting for someone to see it and wake it up. And that's how you will go about developing. Well, look at you. Thank you very much. He knew the coffee line was too long for me to get in there and get some, so he's brought me some coffee right there for my spiritual formation while we're watching the video or something. So that's kindness right there. So the summary then that I would give, since we've been talking about fighting, fleeing, feeding, fornication, family, friends, and formation, is that the limbic system is really about felicity. I'm trying to stay with, how Dr. Warner would do, give it all F's, So joy, felicity, that's what we're actually designed for. And when we lose our joy, our brain then looks at whatever's in front of us and say, you're the one that made me lose my joy. You're my enemy. So the basic of what makes me lose my joy is looking at somebody who's not glad to be with me, who doesn't have kindness towards me, who has no chesed in their eyes when they look at me and say, I'm not sure who you are, but you have value for me. You're one of my people. I need to look out for your welfare. Those are the eyes that let someone see in us what's never been there before. And so typically what makes our brain lose its joy is the other fuel that the brain can run on, and that's fear. That make sense? Brain will do an awful lot of things for joy. We'll do an awful lot of things for fear. But typically, the things for joy are things that we're approaching, we're trying to become a part of. The things that are for fear are things we're trying to get away from. And so your brain is a lot more narrowly focused and stupid when it's looking at things from the point of view of fear. And what I want to point out is that fear is ultimately the driver behind all of the sociopathic behavior. It's people who look at it and say, I'm afraid I'm not going to win. We never look at it in terms of what we want to develop. So we're going to look at a little video right here. Another part of this documentary where you'll get actually have a glimpse into how having your relational circuits go off or become fearful will make a sociopath out of people that wouldn't believe it was possible for them to do that. When our fear system is on, we are wired now for predatory behavior. And we're going to look at every weakness as something to exploit. And so all of us come wired for predator. So all you have to do is shut off your joy and chesed, and now you are ready to act in a predatory kind of a way. So if we can see the next video there, the fear video. When we don't have Hesed in our minds, it's easy to turn someone into an enemy. But when we have Hesed, we know that we will always be connected with them. And it's simply a matter of time before we will be sharing their pain. Whether it's the pain that we created or someone else did. Because the people we're connected to, we must share their life. We must share their experience. We must share their pain. What makes your mind pop back out of sociopathic behavior is that now you know you're going to have to share life. Whatever it is that you do, whatever your impact will be something you will be joining into, you will want to be a part of. So as you see these two sit next to each other, you realize they have entered into each other's pain. And you wouldn't look at that fellow and you know, he's sitting right there next to the woman he attacked. And he's saying, I wouldn't have believed I could do this. But when I got afraid enough, I got stupid. And somehow, the things that make most of us afraid are a lot smaller than what made him afraid. But it doesn't stop us from getting stupid from time to time, right? So if we just stop a moment and think, when was the last time I got stupid about something? You know, just having somebody move into my lane too fast can make me stupid. I stop forgetting I have an attachment to them, that we're part of this community that we have there that's so very small. You see, that's what I'm trying to suggest. We look at these big things. They're a good example for us, but what we're really looking at has very small implications, and we can begin to train ourselves how to handle these in the very small ones. You see, that's how we actually learn to be good at it. Because when the small things happen that make us afraid, and what is it we're usually afraid of? Well, generally it comes down to one thing, and that is we're always afraid of how we're going to feel. Took out the consequences of how you feel, pain essentially drives this whole thing. So people who are intent on avoiding pain are going to be driven by fear, because there's just way too many things that can be painful. But people who are intent on building love will often face things that are scary, right? It's a different way of approaching life. Marcus talked about that as fear mapping or joy mapping the world. Where are the opportunities that I could participate in life and bring more joy than what's there right now? What are the places in life where it would actually be a pretty good thing to have God's presence? So if you're in line at the bank and one line is moving fast and it's got a happy clerk and the other one is moving really slowly and there's grumpy people in line and the clerk is sort of nasty, which line will God want to put his joy person in? Now, if we are looking at the world like I want to avoid the things I'm afraid of, I don't want to have unpleasantness, and I want to reduce my pain, we'll be resentful. We'll go, oh, I always picked the wrong line, and why do they have to do that? And if we're looking at the world in terms of, you know, this is a place that's historically been low on joy, and I have just been selected for one of the moderately hard cleanup jobs. I'm going to bring some joy into a spot where it's hard to find. We are going to be challenged. We're going to be looking for God's presence. What do you want me to do right now? What would my people do in this kind of a line? Right? When they go away, they go, wow, that person in line must certainly have been a Christian. Because nobody else would be that joyful. By joyful, I don't mean that you enjoyed the experience. What I meant is joyful is that, you know, if we've got to be in this kind of unpleasant line together, I'm glad you have me here with you, because I know that God's with us, and you obviously have forgotten that at the moment. See, that's glad to be together, because this is exactly the kind of moment when some God is called for. You see, that's why we're thankful in everything. We rejoice in everything. What are we thankful for? That in this kind of a mess, we've got God with us. We're never thankful for the mess because we aren't stupid. We're thankful that in this kind of a mess, we're not alone. And we're the kind of people that you actually have to have in a place like this, at a moment like this. So you see how that has a different effect, this hesed, that God would so love cranky people in this line that he would send me to bring them some joy, even though they clearly don't deserve it. Right? So now, doesn't that just sort of appeal to you just a little bit to want to be that kind of a person? Wouldn't you love it if that response was popping into your head every once in a while? But when we're thinking about it, we thought, well, I've never thought of that before. And that's why we need a people around us that go, oh, yeah, hey, I have no idea what we would typically say to each other is God must have you there to teach you some kind of lesson. He's clearly out to punish you for something you have done. And, you probably need to learn patience. Right? Have you heard this stuff from Christians, right? And it's no idea that there's life in us that's to be released. It's more like, there must be something God's trying to pound out of you. And so there's a little joy in that, right? We're thinking, I don't want God to show up because he's going to find something in me he wants to pound out of my character. And he'll surely put me in the wrong line in the bank. So what that means is that now we've turned God into an enemy. Our brain has. And we've turned the people around us into enemies, and now all we want to do is win. So we're now sociopaths, essentially. Because usually that just means that if I'm going to win, you're going to lose. So I'm going to make sure you don't cut in front of me in line, or whatever it is that, I will make sure it means that you're not winning. So for today, we're going to use an interesting language to talk about this, because I'm about to have you talk about your enemies. And today we're going to call our enemies Adam and Eve. Now, is there anyone here named Adam? Anyone here named Eve? Because we are not talking about you. All right? So if by some chance there's anyone here named Adam or Eve, that's not who we're talking about. Adam and Eve, we're going to call them, we're going to give the honorary title of Adam or Eve to whoever our enemy is. Because after all, they're the pair who gave us our inner Cain. Right? It came through them. So if we have anyone we should regard as our enemy, it's probably Adam and Eve. So we'll just give them the title of it right there. Because they did us a great deal of harm, if you want to look at it that way, right? So, when we're starting to tell stories, I'm going to have you start telling stories about the time that someone became an Adam or Eve for you. It's often somebody who was in our life who most of the time we liked, or somebody who was neutral. But in order to keep us from having that sense of, I don't want to talk about somebody and make them look bad. Because actually that doesn't build any joy, does it? What we have to talk about is what happens inside my mind when somebody becomes an Adam or Eve, when they become an enemy for me. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do. Does that make sense to everybody? So if you're talking about your oldest son, he's Adam. And if you're talking about your mother-in-law, she's Eve. You don't have to say anything else, right? And nobody but you will know who Adam and Eve are, and yet we can help each other with what do we do with our Adam or our Eve as a people. What would be our response to that kind of a situation? When we don't have Hesed, our brain easily turns others into enemies, and when we are afraid is one of the ways. The other way, it's actually brain is wired for two forms of fear. One of them we call anger. But it's a fear reaction. You never become angry if there isn't a threat. So there's certain kinds of threats you run away from, and the threats that we can run away from we call fear. But the threats that we have to stop or confront we call anger. But they're the same adrenaline, the same neurological response, that same kind of energy that pops up suddenly, fast, and hard Happens the same whether we're afraid or angry. So there's very little biological difference between the two. It comes down to mostly whether or not you're going to run away or have to stop something right there. That is the energy that we have to learn to use for Hesed purposes. So, of course, it doesn't make sense to pick the time in your life you were the most afraid or the angriest to start your training. We want to pick something that was so subtle or slight or small that you almost wouldn't call it being afraid or being angry. Now, actually, there's quite a few large things in that category. As I've pointed out to people before, back in the 1960s, we realized that psychologists realized people were doing all kinds of stuff out of fear. And so we tried to get business people to come in and talk about their fears. And they said, oh, fear, I'm not afraid. I'm a man. I'm in charge. I do whatever it is. Men don't get afraid. I'm not doing anything out of fear. So we could not make any money with the business world trying to get them to come in and talk about their fears. So we decided, some clever psychologists discovered, let's call it stress. That was far more marketable, exactly the same dynamic, but you don't have stress if you don't have fear. It's just fear-driven behavior. But all kinds of people, the executives lined up, oh yeah, I've got a real stressful life. And the psychologist smiled all the way to the bank on that one. But, we engage it. So that's, again, sometimes we don't look at something as fear, but ask yourself the question, is this being driven by chesed? Is this something that I'm doing out of love? Even a lot of times codependency that we think of love is actually fear-based. And that, if you ask somebody, well, why are you doing that? Well, if I don't, and they'll tell you what will happen if I don't take care of this, if I don't do this, if I don't look after that, something bad is going to happen. Now, it looks on the surface like that's loving behavior. It's actually fear-driven all the way through. You're trying to prevent how you would feel if something bad happened. So that's kind of the area we're going to explore today. So our first exercise is going to be to get your relational circuits on. So the thing that I want you to do, and you can, this is one of those little things you can do a little bit intentionally. And that is to express more of what's inside of you. You can turn up the volume a little bit. So a lot of times you're probably aware that you kind of understand God's inside and He's talking to you a little, right? You feel God's presence, but no one sitting around you or interacting with you would have any idea that you've got a sense of God's presence right now. You might think to yourself, God's kind of put a thought in my mind. I think it's from Him. Are we going to tell anybody? No. Right? So the first thing I want you to do is to turn up the sense of God's presence. Now, if God was sitting right in your head, right at this moment, with this room around it, what look would be on God's face? I want you to let that look come onto your face. Feels weird, doesn't it? But shouldn't we be leaking a little bit more of God's presence wherever we go? Like, you have a hard time seeing Him, but have a look at my face here. He's looking at you through my eyes. Right? This is what you need to know from Him. Right? So as we're doing this exercise, turn up God's presence. Now, the other thing you want to do is let yourself be present as well. Christians have this really weird idea that for God to be present, I have to get rid of me. As opposed to, I have to become a good expression of God's presence so that I become so much like my family that you have a hard time telling us apart, but it's not because we're not both here. Right? So, one of the first things my therapist told me, see, my ancestors on both sides were Norwegian. And that, at least, group of Norwegians was extremely unexpressive. And so, the idea was, this is a Norwegian hug. I remember I went to therapy in California and all of that. Went to school, and I went back to visit my brother in northern Minnesota. And somebody dropped me off at the front of the house. I says, "You watch this." So I went up to my brother. He says, "Tim!" He backed literally up the sidewalk and fell into a bush going backwards, saying, "That's not Scandinavian. That's not Scandinavian." He fell over backwards. The lady that dropped me off nearly died laughing in the car. So the first thing that my therapist said to me, you know what, if you're going to relate to people, you're going to be a counselor, you have got to live in your face and in your voice. There's no sign that you're home. People just see this blank look. So for a minute, turn up your presence and listen for it in your voice. If I am here and I'm part of God's love, right? I'm here, I'm part of God's love. How do I want to let that be in my face and voice as well? So it isn't just God looking at you, but it's me learning to look at you the way that my dad does. It's called acquired value. You ever met somebody who you didn't know, but they were loved by someone you did know? And you looked at them and go, well, I got to discover what's so special about you, right? That's what our face needs to be. So turn that up, and we want to kind of keep a balance so that it's not just all me, because your brain tends to do one of those. I'm praying myself and my voice, and I forgot God was here. Oh yeah, that's him. Okay, I'm going to try to put God in my face and my voice. Oh yeah, I forgot I was here. Right? This is how it goes. That means we got to practice putting the first thing, I'm going to let you have a whole minute. It's going to be extraordinarily long time to put yourself and God in your face and warm up your voice so that the next time I let you speak to someone, you know that his tones and yours are going to be there. Okay? So, go ahead. Okay, that was a long time, wasn't it? Now, in groups of preferably 3 to 5, if you can get about that right number. The reason for the group is that if you're about 3 to 5, you'll have about enough time for people to all express something and learn something from each other. If you're in groups of 2, it's much harder to do that. Groups of 1 really don't work at all. And groups of 7 just get too cumbersome. So somewhere on 3 to 5, I would like you to tell the other people in the group your usual response to seeing someone who really loves you. Now, what I want you to do is intentionally put God's presence and be in your voice and face at the same time. So I'm going to, this is to overcome all of those years of training. My wife is one of those people who by nature, the corners of her mouth kind of turned down. And I remember telling her, you don't look very happy. Oh, she says, I'm very happy. I said, I wouldn't know it by looking at your face. So, but I'm smiling. I said, that's a smile. That would sour a pickle. Inside, she had this big smile, but you couldn't tell it looking at her face. It had so learned to just hang there. Because when your brain sees an enemy, it turns down presence. Like, I might get hurt here. I'm not going to be around if I can. Remember Marcus said I go to the back of my mind, a man cave? Well, you go behind your face. You turn off all the connections to your face. I'm not going to be here because I might find an enemy. So all your life, experiences of someone that might hurt you is currently telling your face, don't let you be present. So we're going to intentionally turn it up so that you think this is extraordinarily way too loud, and somebody outside you might barely be able to perceive it. Right? When I think I'm grinning just from ear to ear, somebody go, oh, you got a little smile. We just don't live present. So go ahead and try to let your voice and others say, here is how I usually respond when I see somebody that really loves me. Okay? So think of someone that really loves you and tell your group of 3 to 5 people. Give you about 8 minutes or so to do that. right, I'm going to interrupt you and ask you to add another element to that. Tell the group, do I feel any of God's presence right now with me? Has talking about this made you feel present and made God feel present? Just observe about that along as you're talking, you're telling your story. By the way, it's lovely listening to the group talk about this, just the tone in the room. So go ahead and say, am I sensing God's presence while I'm talking about this? And do I feel like I'm here? So add that to your discussion. I'll give you another 3 minutes. All right, let me have you pause again a minute. And in the same groups that you're in, so continuing in the same groups, I want you to describe your usual response to someone who's a threat to you. Think of someone who's a threat or who dislikes you. And I want you to describe my usual reaction to, and you're going to call them Adam or Eve, right? So when I think of, this is my usual reaction to Adam or Eve. So go ahead and tell each other, now, how do I usually react when I think about Adam or Eve? Okay, have a go. Okay, let me interrupt you again. Stop a moment right now, and I want you to ask yourself the question, how aware am I of God's presence right now? Has this, talking about Adam and Eve, affected my awareness of God's presence? So and then tell the group around you what you notice. All right. That's probably just enough to say a word or two. Now go back to remembering your response to someone who loves you. Think about that again. How I respond to someone who loves you and being present for that. See, does that affect my awareness of God's presence as I enter back into thinking about how I respond to someone who loves me? So think about that a moment. And then notice, does that change your sense of awareness of God's presence? And after that's long enough to notice, tell people what you noticed right there. Okay. We're gonna try one more little experiment with our minds here that's adds to this. So what I want you to do is think of a time when your mind switched someone who you usually like into an Adam or Eve. So normally I like them, but when this moment happened, my brain clicked and I went, uh-oh, there's my enemy. All right, so just silently, we're gonna do this. You're not going to tell anybody, so don't get anxious about, oh, he's going to make us talk about this. I'm not. So just think about that moment. Okay. Now, what is the difference in how you felt when the same person was an Adam or an Eve? If you're going to put in one sentence, how would I describe the difference between those two moments? And I'm not going to ask you to do this, but I'm going to do it. I called Eve, and I was really looking forward to having a nice conversation. And Eve yelled back on me on the phone, you know, what took you so long to call? And my mood went from, oh, this is, to Eve. The main difference is that I was eager to know what was going on with her before that happened. Once that I heard that voice tone, I lost all interest. And the only thing I really wanted to do was to figure out how I could get off this phone as fast as I could possibly go. Like one way I am just, oh, this is going to be good. The other minute, I want to have nothing further to do with this person, you know, and I just want them to disappear. Huge shift for me internally. So as you're trying to describe or put into words for you, what it is, what was that change, you see? You can do that without having to name them. Just said, when Adam or Eve switched into, Adam and Eve, my enemy, this is what's different about me. Just take a moment to put that in a sentence, because I'm not asking you for a long explanation. It's much harder to make a sentence than it would be to tell a 3-minute or 10-minute story. So, one sentence, and then go ahead and tell your group, how would you describe the difference between your response to Hesed compared to Adam and Eve? All right, that was plenty of time for everyone in your group to say one sentence. But you notice how hard it is to just say one sentence. So in order to let you talk, here's what I want you to talk about. How would my life be different if I was better at returning to Hesed? If I could find Hesed faster, how would that change my life? If I could get back to Hesed, you're not Adam, you're not Eve, we're Hesed. How would that change my life if I was better at that, faster? All right, let me break in on these wonderful conversations going on. And if you're standing with your group, I'll let you sit down. We're going to reflect together for a moment or two. So, how many of you are actually able to notice a difference between when I'm feeling chesed and when I'm in enemy mode? Observable, okay. So, looks like better than half of you could on the first experiment. So, let me, as we're thinking about this now together, suppose that the Bible was about building Hesed and joy into the lives of the people on earth. Yeah. So what would it be like if you could anticipate that every time you're going to a Bible study, you would come away better able to get back to Hesed from whatever was going on with you? So that somebody who's just been irritating the crap out of you, you go, man, but that's not going to last past Wednesday because I'm going to Bible study. Right? My people know how to deal with this stuff. They're, between all of us, we're going to figure out how we get Hesed going again, because right now, this person is so annoying. I don't want to see him. I don't want to be close to him. I don't want to be present. There's no way I want to turn on God's love and presence in my face or voice when they're around. And, they'll know what to do about that. That's why we look in the Bible. That's what we talk about together. Or if every time I go to church or, at the end of worship, I'm going to be so much more aware of how God's Hesed is going to impact the places that just annoy me during this week. Would that give us a different expectation about how we're going to deal with our character? See? Oh, prayer meeting. Oh, yeah, man, that's good. That's when we go to prayer meeting for sure. All of the things that have been irritating me all day, everyone else is going to show up all irritated too. And we're, this is what we go to pray about. Because, Lord, you have no idea how Eve has been bugging the snot out of me all day. And I just can't get your presence. But with these people around here, we're gonna see how you see her, because you love the just and unjust. So I don't have to make Eve look good, and I don't have to make myself look good, because I'm sure my reaction is not what you created in me, but I can't find anything else in there today, right? Would that not relieve a lot of our stress? The thing that we're afraid of is we're going to go on feeling like this forever, and if we go to church, they'll tell us just how bad we are for feeling that way. Because we're supposed to believe the right things that make us not be that way, right? Except it never worked. And it's never going to work. It's just not the way things are wired. So if we were a community that did that built Chesed together, knowing that we're all pretty bad at it, it would be such a different way in which we would have to live with our own Adam and Eve reactions. Does that sound appealing to you? Well, when we get together this afternoon, we're going to look at what did Father Ubald actually do with his community that got them from where they were to where they ended up. Now, we'll be looking at it later, but I'll mention it right now. The people, the killers, shall we say, and the victims, they were both members of his church. This is his congregation, both sides. These are not like the people from outside. These are the people from inside. This is my congregation who did this to each other. And isn't that what we always face in our own lives? It makes us hard to get back to Chesed. It's my own people that do this to me. Except now they're not my people, they're my enemies. And in 1 Peter 2:10 it says, once you were not a people, but now you've become a people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you've received mercy. Somewhere in this process of becoming a people, we find that we are changed. Now, true, you believe in God in order to let that go deeper into you. There's something we believe. But it's actually the process of being a people of mercy to each other. And how do we learn to do that when our brains are looking at each other as natural-born enemies? Right? That's the thing we want to be able to get good at undoing. And I think all of us have had a sense that I think that'd be helpful to me. And I think you would also agree that you've probably met someone else that could use a little of that help. Particularly if they're sort of on the predatory side of things. And they seem to have taken over your church, work, community, home, family. I mean, we're run by predators. 75% of the businessmen certifiably sociopathic. A study of pastors indicated that in the Netherlands, 95% were narcissists. Narcissists, and the difference between them and sociopaths is extremely small. In Canada, the study seemed to indicate somewhere between 35 and 70% of the pastors looked into there. Because we put people in leadership because we want them to get results. And the results we're looking for is better numbers, better, performance. We're not actually looking for people who can lead us into how to be more chesed. So we're not picking people with chesed. And you know why? Because people with chesed will tell you what their weaknesses are. And we go, well, if you got that weakness, I don't think we want you around here. And we're looking for someone who's successful. And we look for the leaders that will make us powerful. We don't look for the leaders that will let us expose our weakness and be tender to it. We don't become a people of mercy and grace. But if we were to do that, if we were to revision how Christianity is, where we build Hesed where there wasn't any before, we would stop picking the people who are the best at it. We would start picking the people who have overcome the most.